A more contemporary view of the branches of philosophy than the one presented in Wikipedia replaces metaphysics with ontology, and starts with two branches, ontology and epistemology. Every other field follows with both an ontological and epistemological components. The most popular fields in the last century have been the ones philosophers have been working the hardest on shoring up for science, including logic for math, physics, language, and a number of philosophy, language, for linguistics, especially for semantics in the last 50 years or so, and philosophy of mind for the neurosciences and, of course, philosophy of science. Philosophers, much like physicists in the last century, have also been work on integrating all the fields again after some major paradigm shifts, including making some decisions about whether to group all epistemology under the scientific method, and if not, how to deal with what is excluded. To some degree, ethics or moral philosophy, in that field we don't usually distinguish ethics and morality, as some folk theory does, remains relatively independent. Why give up on metaphysics? Apart from the attack on metaphysics by philosophers like Wittgenstein, the logical positivists, American pragmatism, and the consolidation of epistemology under the scientific method, it's really an outdated term which has lost its semantic value and relevance. Literally, it means above or outside physics. I suppose that would include questions like, what's outside the universe? And, why are laws of physics the way they are? I'm not sure those questions have much meaning to most philosophers today, and if they did, it should probably be dealt with in philosophy of science, not metaphysics. Universities and colleges still teach metaphysics, usually as an introductory course, but I think it's mostly for posterity. Rarely do upper division and graduate courses, let alone the fields philosophers specialize in, involve metaphysics in the traditional meaning of the word. What's more appropriate, and appropriately fashionable, in philosophy is ontology. The ontology of a theory is its structural components, or model. Ontology has a much closer connection to our contemporary view of logic as a tool for building structured relational systems for application. Ontology has a much broader relevance to fields typically not seen as directly related to philosophy. One can talk about the ontology of a website or business. Many large companies, at least in the tech fields, now hire ontologists, the ontology of a logic board, as well as the ontology of a particular theory in science, or of the process of gathering scientific knowledge in general. For all these reasons, ontology is a much more suitable replacement for the archaic metaphysics. Contemporary logics are the best place to start for students who want to learn formal ontology. These can include mathematical logics, multi-value truth functional logics, predicate calculus, modal logic, and set theory. Practical exercises would include building a logic for some presently unformalized ontology in one's field of choice, within or outside philosophy. It's useful for one to abandon the false notion that logic is the study of reasoning. While logic can be used to study the ontology of reasoning, I prefer an open para-consistent inductive process logic where new data streams in, new pairs of values are created for inconsistent data sets, and processes are used continuously to find the largest maximally consistent sets. Limiting logic to reasoning is too narrow for its wealth of real-world and philosophical applications. Two branches for all fields. While I'm not aware of anyone other than myself explicitly advocating the restructuring of philosophy, institutional academic philosophers tend to be conservative to change, especially if it means changing curriculum. I think most philosophers would acknowledge, at least implicitly, that ontology and epistemology are modal components of every field in philosophy. For any field, we have two types of questions: A. What do we know? And B. How do we know it? The one is about the structure of the model, the other about how well it fits to some desired application. The best skill a philosophy student can learn is to quickly and distinctly parse the ontological and epistemological elements from some concept or phenomenon. In the beginning, it's easy to get one's head spinning between the two, especially if one is trying to use the other as a basis. While they are certainly interrelated, co-evolved, it is possible to pull them apart, and easiest when one has a concrete application in mind. At the most abstract level, one can discuss the ontology of an epistemology at the same time as discussing the epistemology of an ontology. just don't try to prioritize one over the other. Philosophy's relationship with science. Philosophers and scientists sometimes have a strained relationship. If it were a marriage, scientists might be viewed as filing for divorce and trying to get custody of the children, while philosophers are attempting to hang on and make it work. Another apt analogy would be viewing philosophers as the parents, and scientists as children at some stage in the life of their science. The older sciences, like physics, have well moved out of the house, want, and require little or no patronage. Newer sciences might be like teenagers, with torn desires to move out but also some interest in continued patronage. Psychologists often ignore philosophers of mind, much more so I think than other neurosciences. Linguists seem to have a much more friendly relationship with philosophers of language. What seems to be historically evident is that the most amount of work being done in some field of philosophy at any time occurs just before and after that field gains significant hardness as a science. In the last century, love them or hate them, this started with the logical positivists, along with their rigorous work in mathematical foundations, and the explosion of different types of logic. With so many more ontological tools at hand, philosophers were able to apply them to fields which had been problematic for philosophers historically, primarily those of language and the mind, but also notably to the scientific method and epistemology. Those applications are continuing today as philosophers delve into the deeper philosophical questions alongside neurosciences into modeling the brain and linguists into modeling language, especially semantics at this point. Whereas historically, there was a time where, even up to Wittgenstein, language and the mind were seen as insurmountable veils of perception to reality, 100 years later it looks like we are getting closer to lifting those veils. Towards unifying philosophy over the last century, primarily because of the impact of institutionalized academic philosophy, philosophers were extremely specialized. A Ph.D. thesis would be something like a very specific and detailed analysis of some particular aspect of some other philosopher's idea. This approach, while perhaps a consequence of the approach of analytic philosophy in an institutional environment, was in sharp contrast with the generalizations and total integration approach of previous philosophers historically. Perhaps one of the last total package philosophers was, ironically, Bertrand Russell, both one of the major contributors to the analytic philosophy approach and a product of the institutionalization of philosophy. Perhaps partly because of the internet, partly because of a decrease in the knowledge divide between those who teach and those who apply knowledge, and partly because we are starting to get a hypermodern control over organizing big data systems, there appears to be a resurgent interest in large unified theories in philosophy, integrating all the fields. The one I'm presenting a framework for here is one such method of integrating the fields, prioritizing ontology and epistemology. The present prioritization of philosophy of mind and language, and the implications of questions in those fields, give them special interest. A good knowledge of philosophy of science is pretty much unavoidable. Most of these answers so far actually respond to a different question: what are the main branches of analytic philosophy? Brent Montgomery's response is very good in this regard. Analytic philosophy is currently the mainstream approach of contemporary philosophers in the United States and the UK. This movement began in the early 20th century in response to idealism and is deeply connected with philosophers like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, along with others. 1. In layman's terms, I would describe analytic philosophy as the view that logic is the fundamental tool for identifying truth and untruth. Opposing views in ethics, metaphysics and so on are best examined through the lens of reason. More could be said, I'm sure, but this can serve as a starting point. Perhaps the bias of this English-speaking Quora community orients us towards a discussion of analytic philosophy. Yet whatever the reason, it must be stated that this is not the only approach or tradition of value within philosophy. The other dominant body of philosophy in the West is continental philosophy. This includes existentialism, a term associated with thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, etc. These are bodies of thought that change the world dramatically and indeed still hold great sway in the minds of millions. Perhaps you hold ideas that were given life by these existentialists. And of course, there are other branches of philosophy that are clearly not covered by analytic or continental philosophy. Outside the West, we find many other philosophical traditions, like Chinese philosophy, African philosophy, and much more.